Hello everybody and welcome to this next session. I'm Genevieve Redgrave, a reporter at Environmental Finance, a London-based publication for financial institutions globally. We've been covering sustainable finance for around 20 years now, so have seen sustainable disclosures from their inception through to where we are now, with disclosure standards covering everything from emissions straight through to nature, and also crucially the evolution from voluntary into mandatory disclosures. But the question really is today, how does this go beyond transparency into actually following through into sustainable investment flows? And so I'd like to welcome the panel here today to discuss this question, and I'll let them introduce themselves. To the stage, please.
Well, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm the 695th Lord Mayor of the City of London. And as such, I represent the 615,000 workers in the city who are about 2% of the British workforce. They actually have the vote, which is an unusual feature, which was, in fact, the case in Hamburg until about 150 years ago, that workers had the vote. Those 615,000 workers are about 7 to 9% of British GDP, depending on how you calculate it. And we also represent the professional and financial services. I'll get off with a straight statement. We're very pro the ISSB, we're very pro sustainability disclosure standards. That said, like anybody who likes something, we could quibble quite a bit around the edges about how it's done.
So I'll start with, I'm African and I'm very uncomfortable speaking before my elder, but I'll accept it. It's always an honor to stand next to Mahmoud. And thank you very much for the endorsement of the ISSB. So I can very easily say that I'm a member of the International Sustainability Standards Board. I'm really, overjoyed that we're able to bring that up in dialogue today. And what we're trying to do, or what we have been endorsed to do by the G7 and G20, and some of the largest countries around the world. So I'm responsible for Africa, and I can say that 23 African countries are on one pathway or the other to adoption of the ISSB standards. 7 already have and have roadmaps for implementing. I'm very glad that my foundation trustee, the IFRS Foundation, Isabel, is here with us. You probably know us more from accounting standards. So we wrote accounting standards for 20 years that were endorsed by IOSCO. And 2 years ago, we were born, and we've written the first 2 sustainability standards, the second one being on climate. And that's the International Sustainability Standards Board.
Right. Well, it's a great honor to join any panel with you, sitting or standing. We were sitting together in Africa a few months ago when you updated us on what's happening in the region, and great to see you as well and to be with you. My name is Mahmoud Mohieldin. So I'm the Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the UN on Financing Sustainable Development. Important time for us because we are all preparing for the big meetings in Seville. This is going to be important in different ways. This is the first revision on finance for development since Addis. We are exploring different options: public, private finance, domestic finance, external finance, debt issues, leveraging, financial innovation, data systems, trade, and debt reduction mechanisms. And all of that require standards. My other hat, which is very much related to what Ndidi and her excellent team are doing, I'm the chair of the advisory board of GFANZ Africa. This is the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero that includes everybody from the public finance to private sector and beyond who are interested in getting climate and development finance together for impact. We are 2 years old, but we are trying to build on excellent work and excellent experience, and that's why I'm here. One final point. Standards, you can ask anyone, do you need standards? Yes, of course. You need benchmarks? Yes, of course. But now that we have 2 important movements, and I think they are both adequately represented here. For good and bad reasons, there are tensions in the global system, and tension because of competition, and tension which is a positive thing, and tension because of the tough geopolitics. And people do not stop So they go regional and they go local at the same time. The best regionalization and best localization that will not really be without standard that can get us back again together in a good global system. That's why, even if we are regionalizing as we should, even if we are localizing as we should, we like really to be in this path that we are going all to refer to the standards. Coming from a village, I was trying to explain the same concept. We have a great footballer playing in England by the name of Mo Salah. So I say, well, same rules apply. Same FIFA rules apply. You live or work in Liverpool, England, or you play football in the village of Negrig. It's the same rules that apply. And here, this is basically what we are after. Standards to be localized don't need to be compromised. Standards to be regionalized, they don't need to be compromised. And we are stuck sometimes until we had some good news coming from you and from the good partnership with IOSCO and some good recognition by the regulators that we can really have some good act together in the right direction. I'll come back to that, especially of the relevance of this work to GFANZ Africa. Back to you.
Well, thank you so much. And just for reference and to kind of set the scene for the audience, which maybe aren't as well versed in sustainability disclosures as my panelists here today, would anybody be able to set the scene really on kind of what sustainability standards are out there, whether that's voluntary or mandatory, and how are they really impacting your members and your work day to day?
So I'll start. I mean, it's so easy to work with this panel. It's so easy to stand here, actually. But so about 3 years ago, you would say that there were about 600 sustainability standards, which is great confusion in terms of being able to speak a common language in very simple terms. And from where we sit, sustainability is really from the perspective of where are the risks. What are the things that you need to look out for, short-term, medium-term, long-term? So climate is a huge one. But there's also social. There's also biodiversity, which we've spoken a lot about. But then there's also the question of where are the opportunities? Where are the new business opportunities? What can we do leveraging technology so that we can transform risks into opportunities? And how do we move from 600 standards, where everybody's confused and overburdened, into one global baseline? And this is what the G7 and G20 and IOSCO tasked the ISSB to do, but not just these organizations, because we ran, call it a referendum if you like, but we like to call it a consultation. And 840 comment letters around the world said, you, IFRS Foundation, who have run accounting standards and helped to standardize those across the world, please do take up sustainability as well. And so we have two standards. The first is the overall sustainability standard, IFRS S1, and we have the second one, which is IFRS S2, and we're now working on a consultation regarding biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services, which includes things like water, and secondly, also human capital. There are three key things that are important to us, and then I'll pass that over. One of them is connectivity. Because we are the warehouse for the accounting standards and the sustainability standards, to make sure that these speak to each other, because our focus is providing decision-useful information for investors. That doesn't mean that every other stakeholder is not important. It just means that we have to make sure that the information that you're pulling together is able to unlock capital flows for transition plans or other businesses that are geared towards being future fit. The second is interoperability. So we do a lot of work with, for example, the European standards, or GRI, which many organizations use. And there are a number of others, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, if you know that, that was absorbed by the ISSB. So there's a consolidation going on, or the SASB industry-specific standards, which are sector-specific. And that takes me to the third thing that we really, really pay attention to, which is, one, stakeholder engagement, constantly listening to the market, and in association with that, what we've heard a lot of is proportionality. So make sure that our standards are useful in all jurisdictions across the world and can be used proportionately in accordance with the skills, resources, and capabilities of the entities that are so using it, and are useful to those entities, not just for attracting capital flows in our land here, but also in terms of being able to protect those entities in the short term, medium term, and long term, and ensure that the prospects of that entity is secured, again, back to the point that it can unlock capital flows.
Well, thank you. I might just point out that one of the fairly obvious things is what are standards for? And they're for making better decisions. That is the core element. I don't need a standard if I'm not making a decision about something. And therefore, you care what does the standard relate to? And many standards have got one label and do another thing entirely. You've got to look at who says so, which is often forgotten. I write a standard, I don't do it. And then we've got to look at what decisions are being made on it. IFRS 1 and 2 in the ISSB is there for accounting, and I would point out, as you rightly say, there are a lot of standards out there, but move outside the accounting sector. I point you to the ISEAL Alliance, which are all the voluntary standards, well, not all, they're a large group of the voluntary standards, there are many more. I would point you to the ISO, the International Standards Organization, and there's quite a relationship with all this stuff. So when you're talking about measuring a ton of carbon, that's not an accounting ton of carbon, that's a scientific ton of carbon. So these are very, very different things. So there's no way that we're going to be isolating the accounting standards on their own without connection to many others out there. I might give you two examples. One is, in the mining sector, there are two large ways of establishing reserves, JORC being one. And so the accounting sector looks at this type of reporting, but this is reporting by geologists. And the geological interpretation of how much is left in a resource or an oil field is one thing that accountants are taking into account. They can't look at it just on their own. If you look at the voluntary carbon markets, I've often said, frankly, the problem with voluntary carbon markets is that at the moment we have too many standards. You know, standards are great. I'm a standard salesman. I sit on the board of the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. We audit the 800 certification bodies and the 3,500 laboratories. I know about standards. How many standards do you want? I'll sell you as many as you like. There's just far too many standards. Now, in the voluntary carbon market, we've again seen a plethora of standards in that space. And one of the things we've been saying in the city has been, we didn't have fire standards until we had fire insurance. We didn't have automobile standards. So until somebody's actually prepared to put up some cash against something, you can write as much standards as you like, sitting in your bedroom thinking what you think is right. You're actually not writing standards for people who are going to have to use them and put their own money on the line. And I think that's where we're starting, the tired phrase, we're starting to see, the metal hit the road here. So I think that's good. But I would point out in the VCMs, one of the most interesting things in the last 6 months has been 5 policies being underwritten in London by insurers. Of course, the interesting thing now is they're looking at the standards that have been proposed for now getting on 30 years, and going, they're not really fit for purpose. So I would be looking at the quality of the financial decisions and who's going to make them and who's putting the money up, as much as I'd be sitting in a room writing things.
Right. So let me connect to the excellent comments now by the Lord Mayor and by my good sister Ndidi on what we are trying to do in the regional platform that we have for GFANZ in very specific areas of work. We have 4 of them. One is related to what the Lord Mayor just mentioned, related to the carbon markets or the carbon credit markets. And the option for our continent, many national initiatives, is to go the voluntary route. But that doesn't mean it's going to be a kind of an old Wild West or East in that direction. You need to have standards, benchmarks, because the biggest question now is basically about the integrity questions related to these carbon markets. Carbon markets were luxury kind of thinking. And people would say, well, it's good to have it. Paris Agreement recommends it. There are a couple of articles with good reference to them. But we see them now as a necessity. One, because of the CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanism coming from the EU and from the UK. And on that, you can have really many ways to go about that. Of course, you can complain to WTO, to my good sister Ngozi, that CBAM may not be WTO compatible. Good luck for the wait, because you may need to wait for years until the evidence of harm will be established. You may have a partnership agreement, as the one that we have with the EU, and the new ones coming with the UK, because UK has a CBAM as well. The third one is to do a transition plan for the companies that could be impacted, like cement, fertilizers, steel, aluminum. But that transition plan needs really to be following some kind of standard, otherwise it will be waste of money. And here we have many initiatives with the GFANZ in the hard-to-abate sector, with the first movers, with many of the initiatives regionally and globally. That needs finance, and for that finance to flow, they need really to make sure that we are going to be following the right standards. The fourth way of doing it is to develop a carbon credit market. And here, there are some recommendations that you may need to check from the IMF updates. If you are an advanced economy, say like Germany or a typical EU country, there is going to be a price. Middle-income country like Egypt or South Africa of the world, they will have a lower price for that. And then lower-income country, which is basically the rest of the African countries, they need to benchmark this. The tricky part here, that you may need to get the advantage. Instead of paying the hefty price of the ETS of Europe or the equivalent in the UK, you still can issue your credit, and in your voluntary market, which will be regulated, and we have a good initiative, is 3 to 4 weeks old, that's going to be showcased at the margins of the annual meetings in Washington by Egypt, to make the issue of a voluntary market disciplined with good regulations and good disclosure requirements in a way as well that can really qualify the market participants for compliance market. I mentioned this case of carbon market. The second one is about the pipeline of bankable, and we rather call it now investable projects. And again, they are full of ideas. First, that they are going to be following the ESG standards, benefiting from the good work of the ISSB. But then my good sister here, Paula, is there in the room. Can you please stand, because I need to recognize your good work and with your country, because everybody's talking about the SDGs. Yeah, she has been the mother, she's not that old, of our work on the SDGs, because that came out from some good thinking, what will happen after the end of the MDGs. So it came from her and a team to push for having a post-2015 agenda that now is the SDGs. We do ESG investment, but with SDG impact, and this is the pipeline of bankable investable projects. And this is a good answer to my good friend Mark Carney when he raised the issue. We have the money now based on the GFANZ. Where are your pipeline of projects? So we said, well, we're going to be working hard with the BCG, with the regional economic commissions and others, and now you can check it on something called assets to flows. The third area of work is on debt reduction mechanisms. Countries in my continent are suffering from debt problems, and we are now working hard in order to make opportunities through debt swaps from the heavy debt into opportunities. But we need to do the alignment, not just as a transactional approach, but to be aligned with a transition plan that you mentioned, based on ESG principles, based on the disclosure requirements, for that debt to be reduced with good opportunities for investment. And that, again, goes back to the issue of having a standard. All of that cross-cutting, while I admire your great work, you are overwhelming the system with the good initiative, especially after the good partnership with IOSCO. Because the missing part, some countries in the continent are ready to engage, others are lacking capacity to implement. And that's why we're very much happy that there is a global coalition for capacity building, again led by the very founders of GFANZ, including Mary Shapiro and Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney, that's providing technical assistance, because sometimes you will be overwhelmed. You have a standard, but you cannot achieve it because of lack of capacity. That requires technology, technical assistance, not to reinvent wheels. And I'm happy that many in the continent are approaching the City of London for partnership and collaboration as well through this initiative.
If I can just throw in. If I can just back again, there's so much collaboration in the room. Also, thank you to the SDGs for the incredible work that you've done, also towards moving from concepts towards data, which is something that we're building on, because if you don't have metrics, if you can't measure, you can't move. Thanks to the City of London, to the UK for the Transition Plan Task Force, for a lot of that body of knowledge has actually now come to us, and it's available so that there is capacity building on how to do a transition plan, because we do not require one. We just ask whether you have one. And thanks also to GFANZ, because we were born at the same time as essentially $137 trillion came towards looking at this, because like you said, if you don't put your money behind it, then it doesn't have traction. But I just wanted to bring it down a little bit, just because also of the session that we had in here earlier today, and some of the conversations around the room, which were to do with younger people. We heard that also in the morning. We heard about smaller enterprises, smaller businesses. We even heard about the informal sector, which in some jurisdictions, and in the Global South in particular, is a significant amount of the economy. And what's so important there is, if you think about it, one of the things that's coming out is innovation builds on a common language. Once we have a common language, and that's all the ISSB is trying to do, one, be minimalist, only investor-specific decision-useful information as a baseline. Secondly, proportionate, to make sure that really it can be used without undue cost and effort. So the cost effectiveness, just like you said, of the standards is absolutely key. And like you said, capacity building. That's one of the things that we came out as early as September 2022 to do. And then, obviously, with you at COP27, we announced the partnership initiative. And so we're partnering with everyone on capacity building, including regulators in their own jurisdictions. But what's so important, I just wanted to say, one of the scariest pieces is Scope 3. Yeah. But if you look at Scope 3 from another angle, what it does, for example, with banks, with finance emissions, for example, or larger entities who are working with, and let me use the example of my chairperson, Emmanuel Faber, who used to be the chief executive officer of Danone, which was the largest food and beverage company. And what he did in Kenya, actually specifically, is work with smallholder farmers to finance putting carbon back into the soil, so regenerative farming practices. And he was only able to do that at no cost to the farmers because he was able to innovate on carbon credits, on voluntary carbon markets. And essentially what they did was get the money back, but they were able to finance regenerative farming best practices among smallholder farmers who would not have gained access to inputs. And yet, as a business, because of that overall farming practice, they were able to do so in a financially viable way. And that is called essentially doing sustainable business at scale that goes all the way down to the last mile. And that's really going to come out of innovation of everyone. And that is the reason why we need one common language and a common baseline that we can all build on.
And I just wanted to add very quickly, I will come back to the implementation challenges in a second, but Alexander Bassen wasn't able to join us today, who's part of EFRAG, and we are missing some acronyms in the discussion, ESRS, SFDR as well, which I'm sure you're all highly aware of. But I just wanted to loop those into the discussion, kind of as a European audience, or kind of sitting here today in Germany, how are these playing a role in today's market, really? I don't know if anybody had any direct.
Well, I wrote a paper last year called Take the C Out of ESG, and I can spell ESG, by the way. And the reason I wrote that paper is when we look across the sustainability, it's quite a wide range of things that we're trying to track. And if you have a proper market in something, then you kind of don't need to track it. We could go on what's a proper market. There'll never be an exactly proper market. So the example I always give is that we in the City of London created the carbon markets. We were COP3. We've been at Rio in every single COP. We ran the shadow trading system and gave it to the EU in 2003, and that was launched in April 2005. We're quite fond of it, quite avuncular even. What you will very rarely hear at conferences like this, though, is how large the ETS system is. Anybody want to have a stab at it? It was $949 billion last year. It covers 24% of global emissions, particularly with the exception of China. These are credible trading schemes. And the voluntary carbon market is just over $1 billion. Now, I'm not anti the voluntary carbon market, but you won't be hearing about the $949 billion at many of these conferences and the things that we can learn about how it works. Now, if we could get that up to about 80%, which is where you start to hit agriculture, which I think becomes very, very messy, and then you have voluntary carbon things on the sequestration element. In fact, I'd like to ban voluntary and call it the sequestration markets. We want to have real markets in sequestration, and the two need to work together, in my opinion. Now then, I don't actually need an ISSB statement for that, because I'll be fined if I'm emitting, and I'll be fined if I haven't been using a credible program. So the objective has got to be to make most of these temporary, transient. In fact, I'd like to remove the word green from green finance. In fact, arguably the only thing that distinguishes green finance from normal finance is high government policy risk and lack of government commitment to creating, effective markets. So we could argue that toss, I'm sure, but I do feel there. Now, the rest of it, though, that still leaves a whole bunch of E. Forestry, fish, water. There's a lot of E left that needs to be tracked because it's unlikely we will have credible markets in the near term. There's a lot of S that needs to be tracked, human trafficking, child labor. I mean, there's a lot of things there that, frankly, will not come into a market, nor do I want them in a market. And then, of course, we got G, and I'm always been a bit skeptical on G, the governance bit, largely because the statistics don't add up. If you run through the statistics, you can prove that chairman should be the same as the CEO. You can prove they should be separate. You can prove anything you like. But I think on S, I'm very, very committed to the sustainability issues. And I wonder if we should, at conferences like this on E, be saying we're going to push much harder to get C out of E and focus on the rest of the E. So some thoughts.
Right. Okay. So a couple of things, a reaction, if I may. Well, we have been, despite the fact that there are only 3 letters, there have been many attempts to get rid of at least one of them. Sometimes the S, sometimes the G, and sometimes have a different concept to the E. And actually, in some jurisdictions, you cannot utter ESG without mentioning that particular jurisdiction. So you say and do whatever you like, but you cannot say ESG because it could be in a challenge in an antitrust kind of lawsuit or something. But here, I think I'm taking it from the Global South, emerging market developing economies perspective, and again with the merits of not to reinvent wheels. And if this is going to be a vehicle for proper financing, and I think when people say, well, this is green, this means that the other is not, which means dirty. When they say this ethical finance, so that means, God forbid, that the others are not ethical. So I think here, if we are based on good standards on the whole comprehensive view on the E and S and the G, I think we are all going to be fine. But the issue here is basically how can we make sure that there is no ESG washing or there is green washing? It's basically about following the same standards. And if we are in doubt, again, going back to my football reference, there is a kind of a VAR that you can really say, well, I'm in doubt, so we can really see somebody who can really verify if we are on the right track or not. The other thing of what you said, that we had a good debate with top minds in Chicago, saying, well, if you are going to be doing the voluntary market rights and you make that regulated, why don't you do it in a compliance-based? I think there is an issue of capacity and the kind of partnership that have been in place in the past, and we are seeing here the ultimate connector through the UN system with his colleagues Achim Steiner, that needs a lot of learning by doing and minimizing the mistakes if we are going to be getting or venturing in a new area of work like ESG without really having the good guidance. In the old good days, the market in China was based in good collaboration from the EU, and that was pre-Brexit, so the UK elements were traveling there. And again, when we are trying to build these kind of markets in Africa, we are quite in doubt that the capacity is going to be flying as smoothly as it used to be. So this is a very big challenge because you can always have a standard and then that may end up in frustration. The second point is basically about how can we mobilize finance, and we're in a meeting just now on the new coalitions and the new alliances for bringing finance where the finance should be going. And that will be following good impact and good reporting system, and that's why we're trying to have some sort of a reference. Some countries are strong enough to say, well, what I publish is what you get, and we have the credibility. Others may need really to go and borrow some sort of credibility until this credibility is going to be recognized and enhanced. The third thing, when we're talking about climate and development finance, and we spent, if you ask me, what was the hardest job in Sharm el-Sheikh is not to bring 70,000 people in a good place, which had been beaten by my good brothers in Dubai, or to have some sort of substantive agenda, which we managed to have, and you can revise that. It's basically about that big challenge that I'm happy now people are taking it for granted, that climate finance is development finance and all follow the same standard. That shouldn't really be confusing. If we're right about this, what kind of finance that should be flowing? And here, what kind of standards, not just the SDGs, because SDGs need this kind of correspondent acronyms to them, ESG when it comes to companies. Because I don't think that companies, when they are serious, they cannot say, well, we are doing SDGs. They are doing that SDG through their compliance at their level on an ESG kind of standard. But then I have the other challenge going forward, is basically if there is going to be some liabilities that are coming. And I give two examples and who can really help us in that, because that is beyond your mandate. That's kind of a global mandate. One, on the climate finance, and you mentioned insurance. There is exactly what we need really to count proper for, and you have the top names, of course, Germany has that, and Switzerland in the insurance industry. And the IDF is something that, Achim, I hope that you may refer to as well in the Insurance Development Forum. We are bringing to the discussion contingent liability that may not be matched by contingent assets. And if there is a gap, you need to bring capital, and that capital will not come without standard. This is the way I see it when it comes to climate. Unfortunately, until very recently, the insurance sector and its assessment of what it's needed for, including bringing standards of risk mitigation and investing where the money should be flowing, is not really adequate in our system. We're very much underinsured. This is one area of work. The second area, while countries with high emissions, the whole continent of Africa is emitting 3% of total. And we shouldn't. I was telling heads of state, we don't need really to brag too much about it, because it's telling us that at the prevailing technology, we're not producing enough and we're not consuming adequately. I would be proud if that emission is based on the new green technology that we have. But actually what you mentioned at the end, that E doesn't just cover the emissions, need to cover the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda on water, food system, biodiversity aspects, deforestation, issues on nature and all of that. And this is harder, including when we read what's coming from the ISSB, including in all of the scopes when you get these issues related to nature, biodiversity, and the adaptation. But now we started to get some good initiatives, including from the forest-surrounded countries, from Gabon to DRC, some good solutions there, and building up to Brazil, there is going to be an initiative based on this, that some of what we spoke about now shouldn't be limited to mitigation, which is important and essential, but we need to bring other aspects of work important for our continent and our countries and many developing economies and emerging markets when it comes to adaptation.
And just very quickly, so I'll let you wrap up in a second, but we have a couple of minutes before we have to hand over to Achim Steiner. So I just kind of wanted to give you all a chance to close out your remarks on what's next, really, for sustainability disclosures. Is it a consolidation of everything we have or an expansion? Obviously, we have seen the release of the TNFD, and we are going to see another launch of a task force very soon. But broadly, what's next, and where would you hope it would go over the next coming years?
Okay, so this is the closing mark. I'll shorten, and maybe I'll just build on what you just said, Mahmoud. Climate finance is development finance. I thought that was a very profound, very short one, and I love the fact that you are mentioning real numbers. So when we're talking about $948 billion, that's a significant amount, and it's market-led, essentially, so it's an imperative. I think that, you know, what we're looking at as well is obviously risks. There are global supply chains that are at risk through several mechanisms that you raised. We're looking at risk itself, where if we don't price or we don't articulate risks and opportunities appropriately, then capital is priced, quite frankly, wrongly, and is not accessible to those locations and jurisdictions where it is most required in order to enable and aid a transition. So we're facing a significant opportunity right now, especially when you look at Europe and the African continent, and thankfully you have interoperability between the standards and the essential importance of having this global baseline that allows for communication and that allows for a cross-referencing across different standards that, and you've just said that we're going to listen to the launch of a new one from Achim Steiner right now, which obviously addresses the issue of inequalities, for example, which is significant. But I think I really like that sentence, development finance is climate finance or vice versa. I think that's worth building on, and that's where I would close.
Thank you. Lord Mayor.
So where are things headed? Well, I think the first thing is, again, to applaud the ISSB. We're starting to wrap up far too many standards and starting to rationalize them. And I think that is important. And rationalizing them in a considered way, not with a, I've got the best answer. You're really trying to broker, and we genuinely appreciate that. We, as you may be aware, we in fact launched a call to action with the London Stock Exchange back in May, with over 120 investors and other groups saying we really do want to see these standards implemented. We're working towards 2025 across the UK. I will see how we do that. And our International Regulatory Steering Group is working with a law firm on a report really on how that transition ought to go as we see it. There's no lack of urgency or no lack of interest because the title here is, levering. And what are we trying to lever? Well, if we can lower the barriers to entry, lower the barriers to analysis, more things get analyzed, more decisions are made. So we're very pro it. I would point, though, to 3 things, if I could. The first is we've got to be very careful that we don't have a proliferation of systems. Yeah. And part of the reason I raise that is when you're a corporate these days and people say it's absolutely insufficient that you're not operating on the carbon markets only, because you can't actually in many cases, but you're now maintaining a completely separate ledger. And I can do 2 of those. I can handle money and something else. But I've got to do money and forestry, money and forestry and water, money, forestry and water and carbon. I stop being able to make decisions. Our economic decision-making system, the standard for making decisions is the monetary impact. That is the standard that economic entities work to. And so we can't have too many at once. And I think that's an evolutionary approach. I think the second thing is we're going to move, we've got to be a little careful too as well. I said one of the core questions is who's doing the auditing? And how many auditors do we have? Now that's a cartel if I ever saw one. Okay. And by the way, I am ex-senior partner of an accounting firm, so there you go. And I put the emphasis on insurance.
Are you audited or not? Are you audited now?
No, I do not audit.
Not free. Yeah.
I put the emphasis there on the insurance. People actually stumping up and saying, I vouch for this standard. So whether it's on the stock market or bonds or actually on carbon, who's actually vouching for it? And that leads me to the last thing. I think we're going to have a maturity of governance. And I do this by way of contrast, because 100 years ago, we went through this on the ISO system. Remember, 180 countries signed up to the WTO and 180 to the ISO system. This is how we govern shipping, it's how we govern food safety, it's how we govern aviation. And I think accountants are often in danger of saying, well, we know what regulation is and how standards are. Look out there. There's some really interesting bits of governance. One, we have accreditors, which are separate from certifiers. Audit firms should be certifiers. Instead, they kind of do both. Those 2 entities are not allowed to influence the standard because they will pervert the standard to make more money. We have a very structured governance structure within the ISOs. We're always trying to keep competition going in the certification area. And these are things that I think are looked at when not being looked at when I look at what I see the ISSB, not as an entity, but the environment that it exists in. And I'd like to widen out that conversation about governance.
Right. In the shortage of time, we're already 2 minutes over time, so I'll be super fast, and then I'll claim any kind of shortage of answer because of the time constraint, as if I have all the answers. But very quickly, building on what you said, and I'll build on 2 things. One, that the World Bank, when I was there with UNDP, we tried to find what were the main lessons from the MDGs to the SDGs. And then, guided as well by excellent work by Esther Duflo, the very well-known Nobel Prize winner because of her work in poverty, she confirmed that in a different way. Main lessons from MDGs for those who made it: better data systems, better finance, and better implementation at the local level. From Madame Duflo, it's 3 things. It's finance again, which is confirming what we have, technology, which should be in the implementation, and behavioral change. Standards are very much in the center of all of that. So I see it, if we're serious, especially building on the excellent speech by Achim in the morning, we are in the right direction, I would say. It's good that you're going to be talking about inequality, because we are not all at the same pace. I congratulate China and India for declaring victory over extreme poverty. China in 2020, India just a couple of months ago. I wish I can say the same for the whole continent of Africa, because we're not on track on this. So in order to be on track...
So sorry, we're going to have to hand over to
exactly.
Achim Steiner now.
So in order to be on track, I think we need to get these issues of standards on the finance, on technology transfer, and behavioral change in the right direction. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks. I'd now like to welcome Achim Steiner to the stage. He's going to give a very exciting new launch and close out this very interesting session. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you.
I feel a bit like an intruder, because first of all, this was a fascinating discussion. I am always mesmerized when I have the opportunity to listen to Mahmoud, because He has the clarity of a professor, and yet he is engaged in everyday reality, like few of us are privileged to do so. So Mahmoud, it's great to listen to you. Lord Mayor, we met yesterday, and Ndidi, I'm in the work that you are doing. I know that my friend Isabel is also here, many different standards. And you just spoke to this challenge. Are there too many standards out there? Well, in one sense, I think every normal human being would agree. And yet, I think in our economic history, we've actually gone through generations of standards. So sometimes I think that the argument that we have too many may indeed be a good incentive to rationalize, to combine things, but like in all things in our economy, sometimes we start up from very different ends of a reality to arrive maybe at an integrated standard, a higher form of standard, a universal standard, because even that is sometimes contentious. What jurisdictions are we talking about? A least developed country or a highly industrialized country? A democracy or an autocracy? These things do matter in the way that we transact on standards. And certainly the argument of complexity, I think, and the onerous nature of reporting is one that I think we all have to keep in mind. Mine is simply a task this afternoon to draw your attention to an initiative that speaks to, let's say, this very creative space in which we are trying to address, in a sense, a very simple challenge. How do those who have money and are potentially investors gain access to the best possible information so that they know what their money will actually cause in a completely neutral sense of the word? Cause in terms of impact, cause in terms of perhaps risks, encounter also risks that are part of informing an investor. I remember 10, 15 years ago when the initiative started with stock exchanges around the world to look at sustainability standards, criteria in stock exchanges. There was an almost religious debate. Stock exchanges are not places where you transact on environmental sustainability. But soon, the argument was actually environmental sustainability is becoming a major risk variable, and therefore to transparency-oriented investors, it became self-evident that stock exchanges should create that kind of transparency. Well, I'm just here this afternoon to share with you on behalf of a whole consortium of actors that there is another task force at the moment that, and I have to say, even I sometimes struggle with the length of its name, but it is just a task force, so it will end one day. But it is called the Task Force on Inequality and Social-Related Financial Disclosures, TISFD. It picks up on the precedents of other task forces of a similar nature. There are, if you want, transient platforms on which very different actors come together and are trying to address an issue that I think all of us at the moment can sense is becoming ever more dramatic. The issue of inequality is driving us apart as societies, as communities, but also as nations. Understanding the significance of inequality in the context of what is referred to as social-related financial disclosures is perhaps for some still a long step in trying to integrate into financial investment decisions something that may seem as if it is extraneous to an investor's decision. I don't think it is any longer. The fact that we have come together with actors from the private sector, from academia, civil society, financial institutions, international organizations, and now have co-chairs who will lead this task force, I think is indicative of a both demand and an urgency that people are sensing. I stand before you this afternoon as the head of the United Nations Development Programme, and perhaps some of you were already at the opening this morning. At that point, I spoke very much about global realities, but the fact of the matter is that inequality is, in fact, probably the #1 factor right now that governments and markets are struggling with. How do you reconcile the objective of a world that is able and ready to invest into a reality that may actually amplify inequalities and therefore lead to the kind of polarization, alienation, and ultimately also radicalization that we are seeing in our body politic, not just in wealthy economies, not just in poor economies. This is something that in UNDP's Human Development Report we have documented in great detail because it is deeply troubling to us as an organization that is thinking about development as a way of advancing rather than actually retreating. And what we are seeing right now is that inequality is becoming a driver that is eroding not only social capital, but increasing also financial capital. And the ability to attract investments, particularly into jurisdictions that are struggling with the issue of inequality, all the way into the core of their political process is also another reason why we feel as a development program it is urgent, important, and essential to address this issue. Ultimately, I think what we have seen with the other task forces, with other standards, and indeed recently we joined forces with ISO to create a standard around the SDGs for investors, is to create more transparency, to create, if you want, both the visibility of risks, but also the opportunity that investors have a right to know about them, but also to make then more informed decisions. More informed decisions will lead, hopefully, to better governance decisions. So it is, in an ideal world, a virtuous circle that we're trying to create with these disclosure formats. I end by just saying that TISFD is something that I think will be a test of our ability to combine what is sometimes a very narrow set of either environmental or financial criteria with a much more complex reality of what is the level of inequality that we think is acceptable in our societies. Elites usually come to a very different conclusion than those who are at the other end of that spectrum. And we heard this morning some of the extraordinary statistics of wealth concentration. We have passed a point where people accept that not everybody will have an equal income. But when you come to a point where people are earning such astronomical sums of money, are able to concentrate wealth to the extremes that we now see in our world today, do not be surprised if at some point people start asking questions that are not just polite questions on television, in parliament, but they start moving onto the streets. And it is precisely for this reason that I think it is essential that we weave this understanding, the appreciation, and also the urgency of addressing inequality into the core of our financial and economic decision-making. In that spirit, thank you for your interest, and I hope you will find the work of this task force one that inspires you, but also informs you about where we need to act. Thank you.